Mexico, a land of mountains and deserts, of jungles and high plateaus, a place where snow-capped volcanoes rise above ancient lakes, and where the ruins of forgotten cities lie hidden beneath the soil. For more than 1,700 years, this land has carried the voices of its people carved in stone, painted in codices, whispered in songs, and written in chronicles. It is a story of empires that rose to greatness and of empires that crumbled into dust. A story of survival, of conquest, of revolution, and of rebirth. By the year 300 CE, the first written records appeared on this land, the stone inscriptions of the Maya. These words, carved in glyphs, mark the beginning of Mexico's recorded history. From that moment onward, the land's memory was no longer carried only in oral tradition, but preserved in writing, dates, and chronicles. It is from here that our story begins. By 300 CE, deep in the jungles of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, the Maya civilization entered what historians call its classic period. This was an age of kings and dynasties, of city-states rising out of the rainforest canopy, each competing for power, prestige, and divine legitimacy. Cities like Tikal in Guatemala, Palenque in Chiapas, Copan in Honduras, and Calakmul in Campeche became the great centers of the world. At their height, their plazas were filled with pyramids, temples, palaces, and ball courts. Their rulers were not merely kings. They were seen as mediators between the human world and the gods, their blood sacrifices ensuring cosmic balance. The Maya were among the greatest intellectuals of the ancient world. Their scribes developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems ever created in the Americas, a mixture of logograms and phonetic symbols capable of recording history, poetry, astronomy, and myth. They inscribed the names of kings, the dates of battles, and the rituals of their gods on stone stele, stucco walls, and folded bark paper codices. Their mathematics was advanced, introducing the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. With this, they calculated calendars that could track the movements of Venus and predict eclipses with astonishing accuracy. To the Maya, time was not linear but cyclical, a sacred rhythm of creation and destruction. At Copan, kings traced their ancestry back through centuries of rulers, each one celebrated in inscriptions. At Palenque, rulers like Kinich Janab Pakal, who reigned from 615 to 683 CE, built elaborate temples and left behind a tomb sealed within the temple of the inscriptions, its stairway filled with carved glyphs narrating his dynasty. At Tikal, mighty rulers such as Jasachan Kea, while I oversaw the construction of towering pyramids that still rise above the forest today. This world was not peaceful. The Maya were divided into rival city-states, often waging wars over territory, trade routes, and prestige. Captives taken in battle were sometimes sacrificed, their deaths believed to nourish the gods. But despite their rivalries, the cities were tied together by a common culture, religion, and calendar. The Maya saw the universe as a sacred, layered cosmos. At its center stood the world tree, its roots reaching into the underworld, its branches stretching into the heavens. Kings spilled their blood to open portals to these realms, drawing cords through their tongues or piercing their flesh with stingray spines. These acts were not merely symbolic. They were believed to sustain the cosmos itself. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Maya world was at its height. Cities sparkled with art and architecture. Ball courts echoed with ritual games, where a heavy rubber ball was struck without hands or feet, and where victory and defeat could carry ritual consequences. Markets traded cacao, jade, obsidian, feathers, and salt. From the jungles to the highlands, a network of alliances and rivalries bound this world together. But in the late 8th and 9th centuries, cracks began to appear. Cities that had thrived for centuries began to falter. In some places, monuments stopped being erected. Populations declined, Palaces and temples were abandoned to the jungle. Historians still debate the cause of this classic Maya collapse. Some point to ecological stress, overfarming, deforestation, and soil exhaustion. Others suggest prolonged droughts, revealed in lake sediments and cave formations. Still others argue that warfare between rival city-states spiraled into chaos, undermining the political order. Whatever the cause, by 900 CE, many of the great cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Copan, and Palenque, had fallen silent. Their pyramids were left to crumble beneath the encroaching jungle. The dynasties that had once recorded their names so proudly disappeared from the historical record. Yet, the Maya did not vanish. Their culture endured, shifting to new centers in the Yucatan, where cities like Chichen Itza arose in the centuries to come. Their descendants still live across southern Mexico and Central America, speaking Maya languages, carrying forward traditions that reach back nearly 2 millennia. For the classic Maya, history was not simply a record of the past, it was a sacred cycle. And in their rise and fall, we see the first great cycle of Mexico's history, an empire born, flourishing, and then declining, leaving behind mysteries that continue to captivate the modern world. But Mexico's story was only beginning. Out of the silence left by the fallen Maya cities, new powers would rise in central Mexico. The stage was set for a new age, the post-classic era, when migrants, warriors, and visionaries would reshape the destiny of this land. The great Maya cities of the southern lowlands fell silent in the centuries after 900 CE. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, once vibrant centers of ritual and trade, now stood in ruins, their temples swallowed by jungle, their plazas echoing only with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. The collapse of the classic Maya marked the end of one chapter in Mesoamerican history. But it was not the end of civilization in Mexico. Far from it. Out of this fragmentation emerged a new age, an era of reinvention, resilience, and reorganization. This was the post-classic age, spanning from roughly 900 to 1200 CE, a time when new powers rose, old traditions adapted, and the stage was set for the civilizations that would define the centuries to come. Across Mesoamerica, societies shifted northward and eastward. Where once the dense rainforest of the Petén had supported the classic Maya, now the centers of power lay in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Gulf Coast, and the central highlands of Mexico. The post-classic period was marked by dynamism. Trade expanded across long distances, new forms of political organization appeared, and the spiritual life of Mesoamerica took on new forms, influenced by both continuity and change. Rising from the arid limestone plains of the northern Yucatan, Chichen Itza became the most powerful Maya city after the classic collapse. Flourishing between c. 900 and 1200 CE, Chichen Itza was more than a city. It was a cosmopolitan hub, a fusion of Maya traditions and influences from central Mexico. Archaeologists have long debated the extent of Toltec influence on Chichen Itza. Some argue that migrations from central Mexico, perhaps from the city of Tula, brought new gods, architectural styles, and rituals. Others suggest cultural exchange rather than conquest. But whatever its origins, Chichen Itza represented a bold new vision of Maya civilization. Here, one can still see the towering pyramid known as El Castillo, or the Temple of Kukulkan. Dedicated to the feathered serpent deity Kukulkan in Maya, Quetzalcoatl in Nahuatl, it embodies the blending of traditions that defined this era. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a series of shadows along the pyramid steps, creating the illusion of a serpent slithering down from the heavens. This spectacle, designed with astronomical precision, reveals the enduring Maya fascination with cosmic cycles, yet also hints at the adoption of new deities and myths. Chichen Itza was also a city of spectacle and power. It's the Great Ball Court, the largest in Mesoamerica, stands as a monument to ritual drama. Stretching nearly 150 meters long, its walls once echoed with the thud of rubber balls and the chants of spectators. The ballgame here was more than sport. It was theater, religion, and politics combined. Some inscriptions suggest that losers, or sometimes winners, could be offered in sacrifice, their blood nourishing the gods. The scale of the ball court reflects the city's grandeur. Chichen Itza was not only a ritual center, but also a political one, attracting pilgrims, traders, and emissaries from across the Maya world. But Chichen Itza was not eternal. By the late 12th century, its influence waned, and power shifted once more, this time to Mayapan, another city of the northern Yucatan. Yet in its time, Chichen Itza represented the adaptability of Maya civilization, proof that even after the classic collapse, the Maya were far from finished. While the Maya reorganized in the Yucatan, another power rose in the central highlands of Mexico. Around 900 CE, the city of Tula, also known as Tallinn, emerged as the capital of the Toltecs. Located about 75 kilometers north of modern-day Mexico City, Tula became the cultural and political heart of central Mexico until about 1150 CE. The Toltecs are often described as warriors, artists, and builders. Their reputation loomed so large in later Aztec mythology that the very word Toltec came to mean artisan or civilized person. The ruins of Tula reveal a city shaped by both military power and spiritual vision. At its center stood the Great Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl, crowned with massive stone columns carved into the likeness of armed warriors, the so-called Atlantean figures. These statues, standing guard on the temple platform, symbolize the militaristic ethos of Toltec society. Tula was a city of trade as well as war. Its artisans produced fine pottery, obsidian blades, and featherwork. Its markets hummed with exchange, linking the Toltecs with distant regions. Through trade and cultural diffusion, Tula's influence extended far beyond its walls, reaching into the Yucatan, where the similarities between Tula and Chichen Itza have long fueled debates about conquest, migration, or alliance. Religiously, the Toltecs elevated the cult of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god associated with wisdom, wind, and creation. Yet within their myths lies tension. Quetzalcoatl, often depicted as a benevolent deity, stood in contrast to gods demanding blood and sacrifice. Toltec mythology tells of a ruler priest, Suacatl Quetzalcoatl, who sought to end human sacrifice but was eventually overthrown and exiled, forced to journey eastward. Later, Aztec legends would identify him with the return of the god himself. Whether historical or mythic, this tale shaped centuries of Mesoamerican belief, laying the groundwork for cultural encounters yet to come. Tula, however, was not invincible. By the mid-12th century, internal strife, environmental pressures, and perhaps nomadic invasions led to its decline. By around 1150 CE, the great city was largely abandoned, leaving behind its warrior statues as silent sentinels of a fallen power. The post-classic age was not defined by singular empires, but by a web of regional powers and networks. Unlike the centralized grandeur of Teotihuacan centuries earlier, this era saw multiple centers rising and falling, connected by commerce, diplomacy, and warfare. Obsidian from central Mexico, cacao from the lowlands, salt from the coasts, and feathers from the tropics moved along vast trade routes. Canoes plied the rivers and coastlines, while port cities like Zikalanko became bustling hubs of exchange. This was an age of migration and mixing. People from the North Xiximec groups, semi-nomadic and warlike, began pressing into central Mexico. Over time, these movements would reshape the political landscape, preparing the ground for the rise of the Mexica, or Aztecs, in later centuries. By 1200 CE, Mesoamerica was in flux. The classic Maya lowlands had collapsed, but northern Maya centers like Mayapan carried on the tradition. The Toltec capital of Tula had fallen, but its cultural memory would live on, particularly in Aztec ideology. Across the region, city-states and kingdoms competed, traded, and borrowed from one another, blending old and new traditions. The post-classic age was not a period of decline, it was a bridge. It carried forward the mathematical, astronomical, and religious achievements of the classic era, while also ushering in new gods, new political models, and new mythologies. The world of 1200 CE was markedly different from that of 300 CE. It was a world poised for the next great transformation, one that would see the rise of the Mexica in the Valley of Mexico and the forging of an empire that would dominate the land until the arrival of Europeans. By the dawn of the 13th century, Mesoamerica was a landscape in transition. The great Toltec capital of Tula had fallen, its warrior statues staring into empty skies, and the mighty Maya centers of Chichen Itza and Mayapan rose and fell in turn. Across the valleys, mountains, and coasts, dozens of city-states competed for dominance. This was a world of migrations, people moving across the landscape, searching for fertile land, water, and the favor of the gods. Out of these movements came one group who would reshape the destiny of Mexico, the Mexica, later known to history as the Aztecs. The Mexica were not originally from the Valley of Mexico. Their roots lay in the north, in a semi-mythical homeland they called Aztlan. According to their own traditions, preserved in codices written after the Spanish conquest, Aztlan was a land of water and reeds, a place of origin and departure. At the command of their god Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica left this homeland sometime around the late 12th century, embarking on a long and arduous migration southward. The journey of the Mexica is one of the most enduring stories in Mesoamerican history. Guided by priests, carrying their god in the form of a sacred bundle, they wandered through deserts and valleys, often unwelcome in the lands they passed. Wherever they tried to settle, conflict arose. They were seen as outsiders, as rough people from the north, less refined than the settled city-states of central Mexico. The Nahua world of this time was already populated with powerful polities, the Tepanecs at Azcapotzalco, the Acalua at Texcoco, and numerous altipedal city-states organized around dynastic lineages. Into this crowded and contested landscape came the Mexica, landless and desperate, yet fiercely devoted to their god. The Mexica's long migration culminated in a moment that has become a national legend. Around 1325 CE, after decades of wandering, the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico. Their god had given them a sign to seek, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. It was here, on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, that they were to build their city. The place was hardly ideal. Marshy, difficult to cultivate, and exposed to flooding, it was land that no one else wanted. Yet the Mexica embraced it as their destiny. They called their city Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus. From these humble, watery foundations would rise one of the greatest cities of the pre-Columbian world. The Mexica did not immediately dominate the valley. At first, they were subjects of stronger powers. Their early years were marked by a struggle for survival. They built canals and dikes, learning to control the waters of Lake Texcoco. They developed the Chinampa system, floating gardens of mud and reeds anchored to the lakebed, which allowed them to grow maize, beans, squash, and chilies with remarkable productivity. Yet politically, they remained marginal. They served as mercenaries for more established powers, especially the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco. The Mexica's reputation as fierce warriors began here. They hired themselves out to fight in the endless wars between city-states, slowly building both their military skill and their political awareness. Even as vassals, the Mexica cultivated their identity through religion. At the heart of their growing city stood the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, who demanded both devotion and sacrifice. Unlike Quetzalcoatl, the more benevolent deity of the Toltecs, Huitzilopochtli embodied struggle itself. The Mexica came to believe that their god had chosen them to sustain the cosmos through conquest and offerings of blood. This belief would drive their expansion in centuries to come. The Valley of Mexico in the 13th and early 14th centuries was a mosaic of competing city-states. The powerful Tepanec capital of Azcapotzalco controlled trade and tribute routes across the valley. To the east, the city of Texcoco held sway, while smaller Altepetl vied for influence around the lakeshore. For the Mexica, survival meant diplomacy as much as war. They intermarried with local dynasties, gradually gaining legitimacy. Around this time, the Mexica elite traced their genealogy back to the Toltecs, claiming descent from that prestigious lineage to elevate their status. This practice of inventing or adopting noble lineages was common in Mesoamerica, where history and myth often intertwined to justify power. The Mexica also developed a unique social and political structure. Their society was divided into Calpulli clan-like units responsible for land, tribute, and military organization. Over time, these units became the backbone of Mexico life, fostering cohesion among a people who had once been migrants and outsiders. By the mid-14th century, Tenochtitlan was no longer just a precarious settlement. The Mexica had transformed their island home into a thriving urban center. They expanded their Chinampa system, ensuring food security for a growing population. They built causeways connecting the city to the mainland, allowing the movement of people and goods. Wooden aqueducts brought fresh water to the city, overcoming the limitations of the lake environment. Religious architecture marked their rising ambitions. The Templo Mayor, though still modest compared to its later incarnations, stood as a dual shrine dedicated to both Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god. This pairing symbolized the balance of war and fertility, the forces that sustained the Mexico world. The city's organization reflected both practical needs and sacred order. Streets and canals were aligned with cosmological principles, echoing the quadripartite division of the universe. Even in its early years, Tenochtitlan was envisioned as a cosmic center, a microcosm of the world itself. Though still subordinate to stronger neighbors, the Mexica were no longer mere wanderers. They had forged a home where none had existed, transforming marshland into a city of canals, causeways, and gardens. Their martial prowess made them valued allies and feared rivals. Their devotion to Huitzilopochtli gave them a fierce sense of destiny. The 13th and early 14th centuries were thus an age of preparation. The Mexica were not yet rulers of an empire, but the seeds had been planted. They had established their capital, legitimized their rule, and developed the military and agricultural systems that would support their expansion. By 1325 CE, the founding of Tenochtitlan marked the turning point. What had once been a despised group of migrants was now on the path to empire. Within a century, their city would eclipse all others in the Valley of Mexico, and the Mexica would claim the mantle of universal dominion, heirs not only to the Toltecs, but to the cosmic order itself. The rise of the Mexica was inseparable from the world around them. They were shaped by the collapse of Tula, by the shifting alliances of the post-classic, by the migrations and conflicts of the Valley of Mexico. Their destiny was tied to both the environment and the belief in the marshes of Lake Texcoco and to the demands of their god. The centuries after 1325 would see them transform from vassals to conquerors, from island dwellers to lords of an empire stretching across Mesoamerica. But in these early years, their story was still one of survival, resilience, and vision. From Aztlan to Tenochtitlan, the Mexica carried with them the conviction that they were chosen, and in that conviction lay the foundations of their golden age to come. From the moment the Mexica raised the first temples on the marshy island of Tenochtitlan in 1325 CE, their fate began to shift. What started as a city born of necessity, carved out of swamps and shallows, would, within less than 2 centuries, rise into one of the largest and most dazzling urban centers in the world. By the year 1500, the Mexica had become the rulers of an empire, their capital a glittering jewel of stone and water. Yet this golden age was not only a story of triumph and expansion, but also one of ritual obligations, ceaseless warfare, and a belief that the very survival of the cosmos rested upon their shoulders. The early Mexica rulers remained under the dominance of the Tepanec Empire, whose capital at Azcapotzalco controlled much of the Valley of Mexico in the late 14th century. For decades, the Mexica paid tribute to the Tepanec kings, serving as their soldiers and vassals. This relationship gave the Mexica valuable experience in warfare and diplomacy, but also fueled their ambition for independence. In 1428 CE, a turning point came. The Mexica, led by their ruler Itzcoatl, allied with the city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan to overthrow Azcapotzalco. This alliance, known as the Triple Alliance, would form the backbone of the Aztec Empire. Under its terms, the three powers shared the spoils of conquest and tribute, though in time Tenochtitlan emerged as the dominant force. The victory over the Tepanecs marked the true beginning of the Mexica's golden age. From this point forward, the Mexica were no longer outsiders or mercenaries, but recognized masters of their own destiny. Following the establishment of the Triple Alliance, the Mexica launched a century of nearly unbroken military campaigns. One ruler after another, Itzcoatl, 1427 to 1440, Moctezuma I, 1440 to 1469, Ashiocatl, 1469 to 1481, Tizoc, 1481 to 1486, and Ahuitzotl, 1486 to 1502, expanded the empire's reach through conquest and alliances. Under Moctezuma I, the empire consolidated its power across the Valley of Mexico and extended south into the fertile lands of Morelos. Moctezuma also confronted one of the great challenges of the time, a devastating famine between 1450 and 1454 CE caused by drought and crop failures. In response, the Mexica adopted new agricultural techniques and strengthened their reliance on Chinampas. This crisis hardened the empire, instilling in its leaders the belief that divine favor depended on constant sacrifice and vigilance. Under Ahuitzotl, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. By the end of the 15th century, Aztec armies had campaigned as far as modern-day Guatemala. Tributary provinces poured wealth into Tenochtitlan: cacao, cotton, feathers, jade, turquoise, and above all, food. The city became the center of a network that linked diverse peoples and regions, bound together by tribute and the threat of military reprisal. At the heart of this empire stood Tenochtitlan, a city unlike any in the world at the time. Situated on an island in Lake Texcoco, it was connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the springs of Chapultepec, while canals crisscrossed the city, serving both transport and irrigation. By 1500 CE, Tenochtitlan is estimated to have housed between 200,000 and 250,000 inhabitants, making it larger than most European capitals of the day. Visitors marveled at its order, its cleanliness, and its markets. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the twin city to Tenochtitlan, could host tens of thousands of people daily, trading everything from obsidian blades to tropical fruits, jaguar pelts to gold jewelry. Towering over the city was the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, rebuilt and expanded by successive rulers until it dominated the sacred precinct. Its twin shrines honored Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. At its steps, rituals were performed that, in the Mexico worldview, ensured the rising of the sun and the continuation of life itself. The Mexica lived within a cosmos charged with divine energy, but also fraught with danger. According to their mythology, the world was in its fifth age, sustained only by human action. The gods themselves had sacrificed to bring forth the sun, and humanity was bound to repay that debt through offerings of blood and life. Thus, sacrifice was not cruelty for its own sake, but a cosmic necessity. Prisoners of war, taken in ritualized battles known as Zakiayotl flower wars, were brought to Tenochtitlan to be offered on the altars. The spilling of blood, the beating of drums, and the chants of priests were all acts to nourish the gods and stave off cosmic collapse. The central role of sacrifice has often been exaggerated or misunderstood, but it is undeniable that for the Mexica, warfare and religion were inseparable. Conquest provided not only tribute, but also captives to fuel the ritual cycle. The empire's military machine was thus bound to its cosmology, driving the constant expansion of its frontiers. The Golden Age of the Mexica was also a period of social organization and cultural flowering. Society was divided between nobles, Pipiltin, and commoners, Masahualtin, though opportunities for advancement existed, especially through military achievement. A young warrior who captured prisoners in battle could rise in rank, gaining land and privileges. Education was widespread, with schools for both noble and commoner children. Boys were trained in warfare, crafts, or the priesthood, while girls were prepared for roles in weaving, ritual, and domestic life. Poetry, music, and art flourished, with rulers such as Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco celebrated as philosopher kings whose verses are still remembered. Craftsmen produced intricate works in gold, turquoise mosaics, and feather art of breathtaking delicacy. The Mexico worldview, rich in symbolism, infused every aspect of their culture, from codices painted with histories and genealogies to the very layout of their city. The Empire of the Mexica was not a monolithic state, but a network of tribute relationships. Conquered provinces were allowed to keep their rulers and customs, provided they delivered regular payments in goods and captives. Tribute lists preserved in codices detail vast quantities of textiles, cacao, maize, and luxury items sent to Tenochtitlan. Yet this system bred resentment. Some subject peoples chafed under heavy demands and looked for opportunities to resist. Certain regions, such as the Tlaxcala Confederation, remained unconquered, locked in constant warfare with the Mexica. Ironically, it would be these tensions that later provided fertile ground for alliances with the Spaniards. By the year 1500, under the rule of Moctezuma II, 1502 to 1520, the Mexica Empire stood at its zenith. Its armies were feared, its markets vibrant, its capital magnificent. To outside observers, it seemed an unassailable civilization at the height of its golden age. Yet beneath the surface lay fragility. The empire depended on continuous expansion to supply captives for sacrifice and goods for tribute. Discontent simmered in conquered provinces. Famine, drought, or internal conflict could destabilize the delicate balance. And across the sea, forces unknown to the Mexico were already on the move, ships bearing strangers whose arrival would bring cataclysm. But in these final decades before contact, the Mexica lived as lords of Mesoamerica, their cities shining in the sunlight of Lake Texcoco, their temples reaching toward the sky. They believed themselves chosen to sustain the world, and for a century, they had done just that through conquest, ritual, and unyielding devotion to their gods. By the 12th century, Mexico was in motion once more. The cities of the Toltecs had already faded into myth, their ruins half buried, their glory remembered in stories of warrior kings and feathered serpents. Across the high plateau of central Mexico, a succession of peoples rose and fell, each leaving behind fragments of power. It was in this shifting landscape that a new people began their rise, a people who called themselves the Mexica, but who the world would come to know as the Aztecs. The Mexica did not begin as rulers. They began as wanderers. Their legends told of a long migration from a homeland called Aztlan, a place somewhere to the north, remembered in myth as an island of white herons. Guided, they believed, by the god Huitzilopochtli, they searched for the sign he had promised them, an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. For decades, they were outcasts. Existing tribes saw them as crude and barbarous. The Mexica were often expelled from settled areas, forced into marshlands and wastelands. But hardship forged them. They became skilled in war, hired as mercenaries by more powerful city-states in the Valley of Mexico. By the early 14th century, the Mexica had settled on islands in the western swamps of Lake Texcoco. In 1325, according to their own records, they saw the prophesied sign, the eagle and serpent upon a cactus. Here, they built the foundations of a city they named Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. What began as a collection of huts among the reeds would grow into one of the largest and most powerful cities of the pre-Columbian world. Tenochtitlan's location seemed unpromising, a marshy island surrounded by brackish water. But the Mexica turned disadvantage into strength. They built chinampas, floating gardens constructed from layers of mud, reeds, and soil tethered to the lake bed. These plots produced maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers in astonishing abundance, creating one of the most productive agricultural systems in the Americas. The city itself was laid out with causeways linking it to the mainland and canals crossing it like veins of water. By the 15th century, Spanish accounts described Tenochtitlan as a city of stone temples, whitewashed palaces, and bustling markets, shimmering in the middle of the lake like a vision. Yet the Mexica's rise was not secured by agriculture alone. Their society was built upon warfare. From an early age, boys were trained to fight, and military achievement was the primary route to prestige. The capture of enemies was valued more than their death, for captives were destined to fuel the ritual machinery of the state. In 1428, after years of subjugation to the powerful Tepanec city of Azcapotzalco, the Mexica allied with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to overthrow their overlords. This alliance, known to history as the Triple Alliance, became the foundation of the Aztec Empire. Over the next century, the Aztecs expanded across central Mexico with astonishing speed. Their armies moved south into the fertile valleys of Oaxaca, east to the Gulf Coast, and as far as the forests of Guatemala. Conquest was not simply about territory. Subjugated cities were required to pay tribute: gold, cacao, cotton, feathers, maize, and above all, people. The Aztec Empire was less a centralized state than a vast network of tribute relationships, maintained through fear and the ever-present threat of violence. At the center of this empire stood Tenochtitlan, now transformed into a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people by the early 16th century, larger than any city in Europe at the time except perhaps Paris and Constantinople. Its heart was the Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid, rising in twin staircases to shrines dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rain, and Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun. Here, the most solemn rituals were performed. Sacrifices of captives were offered to sustain the gods and keep the cosmos in balance. For the Aztecs, the universe was fragile, perched on the edge of collapse. Their myths told of the 5 suns' previous worlds destroyed by fire, flood, and earthquake. They believed themselves to be living in the age of the 5th sun, and that only constant offerings of blood could prevent its end. Sacrifice was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was, in their view, the very mechanism by which the universe was sustained. The society beneath this religious and military order was complex and stratified. At the top was the Tlatonani, the emperor, whose authority was both political and sacred. Nobles controlled land, commanded armies, and served as priests and judges. Commoners, the machete farmed, crafted, and traded, while slaves, often war captives, served households or awaited sacrifice. Yet the Aztec world was not closed. A man could rise through military prowess, capturing enemies for sacrifice, and thereby earn noble status. Markets were central to Aztec life. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's twin city, was said to host 40,000 traders on busy days, selling everything from obsidian blades to cacao beans, from fine cotton mantles to live animals. Spanish witnesses, when they first saw it, compared it to the markets of Venice or Constantinople. Despite its power, the Aztec Empire had cracks. Its rule was resented by many subject peoples, who bore the weight of tribute and sacrifice. Some, like the Tlaxcalans, remained fiercely independent, locked in perpetual warfare with the Mexica in what were called flower wars, ritual battles designed to capture prisoners for sacrifice. These tensions would later play a decisive role in the events of conquest. The Aztecs were also heirs to centuries of Mesoamerican culture. They adopted much from the Toltecs and others, religious deities, the calendar system, artistic styles, and even myths. They saw themselves as inheritors of a sacred lineage, restoring the greatness of earlier civilizations. But their empire was young. It had risen in little more than a century and a half, a meteoric rise built on conquest and fear. In 1502, the throne passed to Moctezuma II, a man of noble bearing and deep religiosity. Under his reign, the empire reached its height in size, but it also became more rigid and stratified. Moctezuma expanded palaces, strengthened the nobility, and presided over grand rituals. Yet even as Tenochtitlan shone in magnificence, new forces were approaching from beyond the horizon. To the east, across the ocean, Spanish explorers had already touched the coasts of the Caribbean. In 1517, expeditions reached the Yucatan Peninsula, bringing tales of powerful cities inland. Within 2 years, Hernán Cortés would land on the coast of Veracruz, setting in motion one of history's most dramatic encounters, the clash of two worlds, each ancient in its own right, but utterly alien to the other. The Aztec world, with its dazzling achievements and its brutal demands, stood on the cusp of transformation. The empire that had risen from swamps and exile, that had conquered and reshaped the Valley of Mexico, was about to meet its greatest test. In the spring of 1519, ships appeared on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, carrying men from a distant world. They came from Spain, a kingdom that only decades earlier had completed its own centuries-long struggle, the reconquest of Iberia from Muslim rule. These men were hardened soldiers, seasoned in war, and driven by ambition, faith, and hunger for wealth. At their head was Hernán Cortés, a man of cunning, charisma, and audacity. His arrival would mark the beginning of one of the most consequential encounters in world history, the fall of the Aztec Empire and the violent birth of colonial Mexico. Cortés had not been authorized by the Spanish crown to lead a conquest. He had been dispatched by the governor of Cuba to explore and trade. Yet when he landed on the coast near modern Veracruz, he had other ideas. He founded the town of Villa Rica de la Veracruz, and in doing so claimed direct allegiance to King Charles of Spain, cutting ties with his superior in Cuba. To ensure that his men had no thought of retreat, he ordered his ships scuttled. From that moment, there was no turning back. The Spanish force numbered fewer than 600 men, with about 16 horses and a few small cannon. In contrast, the Aztec Empire ruled over millions. Yet Cortés possessed advantages: steel weapons, mounted cavalry, firearms, and above all, the ability to exploit rivalries among the peoples subject to Aztec power. From the coast, Cortés began marching inland, seeking allies. On the way, he encountered the Totonacs, who had long resented Aztec tribute demands. They agreed to support the Spanish. More crucial still was the alliance he forged with the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcala Confederation had resisted Aztec domination for decades, locked in continual warfare with the Mexica. At first, the Tlaxcalans fought the Spaniards fiercely, but after days of battle, they saw potential in these strange newcomers. They struck an alliance, providing thousands of warriors who would march alongside Cortés all the way to Tenochtitlan. Key to Cortés' success was also the presence of a woman remembered in history as Malintzin or La Malinche. She was given to the Spaniards as a slave after early battles, but quickly became indispensable as an interpreter, advisor, and intermediary. Fluent in both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Maya, she allowed communication between Spaniards and indigenous peoples. For Cortés, she was a bridge into the world of central Mexico. For later generations, she became a symbol of betrayal to some and of survival and adaptation to others. As Cortés advanced, word of the strangers reached Moctezuma II in Tenochtitlan. The emperor was troubled. The Mexica believed the cosmos was governed by cycles, and some interpreted these newcomers as omens of the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, whose legend foretold a return from the east. Moctezuma hesitated, uncertain whether to crush these intruders or to welcome them. He sent emissaries bearing gifts, gold, textiles, and food. To the Spaniards, the gifts confirmed that riches lay ahead. To Moctezuma, they were perhaps intended as a warning or appeasement. By November of 1519, Cortés and his growing force, now thousands strong with indigenous allies, reached the Valley of Mexico. The Spaniards marveled at their first sight of Tenochtitlan, rising out of the waters of Lake Texcoco, connected by great causeways, gleaming with temples and palaces. One Spaniard would later write that it seemed like an enchanted vision, greater than any city in Europe. Moctezuma, after much debate, chose to allow Cortés into the city. On November 8th, he welcomed the Spaniards with ceremony, offering hospitality in his palace. For months, the uneasy coexistence continued. Cortés, fearing betrayal, soon took Moctezuma prisoner in his own palace, ruling the empire through him as a puppet. But events elsewhere soon turned the tide. In 1520, Cortés briefly left the city to confront a Spanish expedition sent from Cuba to arrest him. In his absence, his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, oversaw a massacre during a festival in the Templo Mayor, slaughtering Aztec nobles and priests. When Cortés returned, Tenochtitlan was an open revolt. The Mexica rose against the intruders, laying siege to the Spanish within the palace. In the chaos, Moctezuma was killed. Spanish sources claimed he was struck by his own people's stones. Aztec sources accused the Spaniards of murder. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards attempted to flee the city under cover of darkness. Laden with stolen gold, many drowned in the canals or were cut down by Aztec warriors. This night became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Of the Spaniards' original force, hundreds were lost. Yet Cortés was not finished. Retreating to Tlaxcala, he rebuilt his strength, forging an even larger coalition of indigenous allies who sought to overthrow the Mexica. For many people of central Mexico, the arrival of the Spaniards offered a chance for revenge against their imperial overlords. With their help, Cortés prepared for a final assault. In 1521, the Spaniards returned to Tenochtitlan. This time, they brought ships, brigantines assembled from parts carried over the mountains, and launched on Lake Texcoco. For weeks, they cut off the city's supply lines, blockading it from the water while allies besieged it from land. The siege was brutal. Famine and disease ravaged the city. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by the Europeans, spread through the population, devastating the Mexica and killing their new emperor, Cuitlahuac. By August of 1521, after 3 months of relentless assault, Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. The great temples were pulled down, the palaces burned, the canals clogged with the dead. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured as he attempted to flee across the lake. The city that had once been the jewel of Mesoamerica was reduced to rubble. With its fall, the Aztec Empire collapsed. Cortés declared the city for Spain, renaming it Mexico Tenochtitlan, soon to become Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. Upon the ruins of the Aztec capital, a new colonial order was being built, one that would reshape the lives of millions. The conquest of Mexico was not the triumph of a few hundred Europeans alone. It was the product of complex alliances, indigenous rivalries, and catastrophic epidemics. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other warriors fought alongside Cortés, seeking freedom from Aztec rule. Disease did what Spanish steel could not, crippling the population and weakening resistance. Yet for the peoples of Mexico, the conquest marked not liberation, but the beginning of centuries of colonization. Spanish power was established not only by conquest, but by the dismantling of temples, the imposition of Christianity, and the redistribution of lands. The Mexico world, with its gods, its rituals, and its empire, had fallen. In its place arose a colonial society that would merge Spanish and indigenous worlds in ways neither could have imagined. By the end of 1521, Mexico stood transformed. The age of the Aztecs was over, and the age of New Spain had begun. The conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521 did not end the wars of Mexico, but it marked the beginning of a new era. The city that had once stood as the heart of the Aztec world was reduced to rubble, its canals filled with corpses, its temples toppled, its palaces broken. On its ruins, the Spaniards laid out a new city, built in their own image but haunted by the stones of the old. They called it Mexico City, the capital of a new viceroyalty that they named New Spain. From this city, Spanish rule extended over an immense territory stretching not only across the lands of modern Mexico, but also over Central America, the Caribbean, and as far north as the deserts of New Mexico and the plains of Texas. For the Spanish crown, New Spain was the jewel of its overseas empire, a land rich in people, in silver, and in possibilities. But for the indigenous peoples who lived there, it was the beginning of centuries of subjugation, transformation, and survival. After the conquest, Hernán Cortés and his men immediately began reshaping Tenochtitlan. Churches rose where temples once stood. The great Templo Mayor, once the sacred heart of the Mexico world, was torn down stone by stone, its materials reused in the foundations of Spanish cathedrals. Streets were widened and laid out in European grids. At the center of the new Mexico City, the Spaniards erected the Metropolitan Cathedral, a towering statement of Christian dominance. Yet beneath these new foundations, the old city endured. The labor that built New Spain came from indigenous workers, often coerced through systems like the encomienda, which granted Spanish settlers rights over native labor and tribute. Disease had already devastated the population. Waves of smallpox, measles, and typhus tore through the indigenous peoples of Mexico in the decades after the conquest. By some estimates, the population of central Mexico fell by as much as 80 to 90% between 1520 and 1600. Entire villages vanished, leaving the Spaniards ruling over a depopulated but still resilient land. The society that emerged in New Spain was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the peninsulars, Spaniards born in Iberia who came to the New World to govern, trade, and profit. Beneath them were the criollos, Spaniards born in Mexico, who grew wealthy but remained excluded from the highest offices of church and state. Below them stretched a complex spectrum of mixed populations. The children of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers formed a new group, the mestizos, who would become central to Mexican identity. Africans were brought as slaves to labor in mines and haciendas, adding another strand to the social fabric. Out of these mixtures arose what was called the casta system, an elaborate racial taxonomy depicted in colonial paintings. Labels like mestizo, mulatto, castizo, and others attempted to categorize people by the degree of Spanish, indigenous, and African ancestry. Though artificial, these categories shaped daily life, access to land, and social mobility. At the bottom of the colonial order remained the vast majority of indigenous peoples. They were forced into tribute labor, often working the lands that their ancestors had once owned. Yet the Spaniards also relied on their cooperation. Indigenous elites were co-opted into the system, serving as intermediaries between their communities and the crown. Town councils, or cabildos, were preserved under Spanish oversight, allowing local leaders to maintain a measure of influence. If the Spanish crown ruled through law and soldiers, the Catholic Church ruled through faith and culture. Missionaries Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuits spread across New Spain, building monasteries, schools, and churches. They sought not only to convert, but to replace the cosmology of the indigenous world with that of Christianity. Idols were smashed, temples torn down, rituals outlawed. Yet conversion was not a simple erasure. Indigenous peoples reinterpreted Christian teachings in their own ways. Old gods and saints blended. In 1531, the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe emerged as the tale of a dark-skinned Virgin Mary who appeared to an indigenous man, Juan Diego, on the hill of Tepeyac. Her image, printed on a miraculous cloak, became a unifying symbol of New Spain, venerated by both Spaniards and natives. She would later stand as a symbol of independence and national identity. The church grew immensely wealthy and powerful, owning vast estates and influencing politics. But it also provided some protection. Certain friars, most famously Bartolomé de las Casas, denounced the abuses inflicted on indigenous peoples, arguing for reforms. Though never fully realized, these debates helped establish the principle that the native peoples of the Americas were human beings with souls, a recognition not universally accepted in the early years of conquest. The wealth of New Spain rested above all on silver. In the mid-16th century, vast deposits were discovered in places like Zacatecas and Guanajuato. Mines dug deep into the mountains, worked by indigenous and African laborers, became the beating heart of the colonial economy. Silver from Mexico poured into Spain and then across Europe and Asia, fueling the rise of global trade. Spanish galleons carried it to Manila in the Philippines, where it was exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain. New Spain was not a provincial backwater, but one of the great engines of the early modern world economy. This wealth, however, did not trickle down. Mining towns were notorious for brutal conditions, where workers often died from accidents, exhaustion, or mercury poisoning used in refining the ore. Indigenous communities were forced into repartimiento systems. Draft labor was drafted, rotating men into the mines for periods of grueling service. Throughout the 3 centuries of colonial rule, indigenous and African peoples resisted in countless ways. Some rose in open rebellion. In 1541, in the Mixton War of Western Mexico, Caxcanes and their allies fought fiercely against Spanish forces before being crushed. In the north, the Chichimeca Wars raged for decades as nomadic peoples resisted Spanish expansion. Enslaved Africans also rose in revolt, establishing communities of runaway slaves known as palenques in remote areas. Others resisted through more subtle means, preserving languages, rituals, and traditions under the guise of Catholic practice. Nahuatl, Maya, Mixtec, and Zapotec languages endured, spoken in homes and villages even as Spanish became the language of power. Ancient agricultural practices continued in hidden fields. Survival itself became resistance. By the 18th century, Spain sought to tighten its grip on New Spain. Under the Bourbon dynasty, reforms were introduced to increase efficiency and crown revenues. Trade restrictions were loosened, taxes increased, and more peninsulars were appointed to high office, marginalizing Criollos further. At the same time, Enlightenment ideas spread, carried by books and whispers. Concepts of equality, liberty, and reason challenged the rigid hierarchies of colonial society. Criollos, educated yet excluded, began to resent their subordination to officials born in Spain. Indigenous communities bore the brunt of heavier tribute demands and land encroachments. Discontent simmered across the land. By the late 18th century, the world beyond New Spain was shifting. In 1776, the American Revolution shook the colonies of Britain. In 1789, the French Revolution toppled the monarchy in Europe. In 1804, Haiti, the richest colony in the Caribbean, won independence through a massive slave revolt. These events did not go unnoticed in Mexico. They planted the idea that colonial rule was not eternal, that empires could fall. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and placed his brother on the throne, a crisis of legitimacy spread through the Spanish world. In Mexico, Criollos and mestizos began to organize in secret, plotting the overthrow of Spanish rule. The era of colonial Mexico was drawing to its end. For 3 centuries, from 1521 to 1821, New Spain had been forged in conquest, built on silver, ruled through faith and hierarchy, and marked by both oppression and adaptation. The society that emerged was neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous, but something new, a complex, often brutal fusion. Out of that fusion would rise the independence movement, the next great chapter in the history of Mexico. The year was 1810, and 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule weighed heavily on New Spain. Beneath the surface of Mexico's rigid social order, resentment had been building. The Peninsulars, Spaniards born in Europe, monopolized the highest offices of government, church, and commerce. Criollos, Spaniards born in Mexico, were wealthy and influential but excluded from true political power. Below them, millions of mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans bore the burdens of tribute, labor, and poverty. The Bourbon reforms of the 18th century had only deepened these divides. Heavier taxes, land encroachments, and restrictions on local autonomy created bitterness. Meanwhile, the great upheavals of the wider world, the American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolution, 1789, and above all, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, showed that colonial empires could be overturned, that new nations could be born. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and forced King Ferdinand VII from the throne, legitimacy itself collapsed. Across Spain's empire, the question arose: if the king had been deposed, to whom did the colonies owe allegiance? In Mexico, Criollo elites and radical priests began to answer to no one. The time for independence had come. In the early hours of September 16, 1810, in the small town of Dolores, a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the church bell and called upon his parishioners to rise. His speech, remembered as the Grito de Dolores, condemned Spanish tyranny and called for the end of oppression. He marched at the head of a growing army of mestizos, peasants, and indigenous villagers, carrying a banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the dark-skinned mother of Mexico, a symbol that united faith with revolution. Hidalgo's forces surged through the countryside, seizing cities like Guanajuato and Guadalajara. Their revolt terrified elites, both peninsular and Criollo, for it threatened not only Spanish rule, but the entire colonial hierarchy. In January 1811, Hidalgo was captured and executed, but the spark had been lit. Leadership of the insurgency passed to José María Morelos, another priest of humble origins. Morelos was a skilled strategist and visionary. He organized a congress in 1813 at Chilpancingo, which declared Mexico's independence, and drafted a constitution that abolished slavery, caste distinctions, and tribute. His vision was of a nation of equality and justice. But Morelos, too, was captured and executed in 1815. For years, the war dragged on, fought by scattered guerrilla bands in the mountains and countryside. Leaders like Vicente Guerrero, of mixed African and indigenous heritage, kept the struggle alive in the South. Ironically, it was not radical revolutionaries, but conservative criollos who would finally bring independence. By the 1820s, Spanish power was faltering, and fears of liberal reforms in Spain pushed Mexican elites to embrace independence as a way to preserve their privileges. In 1821, the royalist officer Agustin de Iturbide switched sides, joining forces with Guerrero under the Plan of Iguala. The plan promised three guarantees: independence from Spain, equality between criollos and peninsulars, and the preservation of Catholicism. On September 27, 1821, the army of the three guarantees marched into Mexico City. Independence had finally been achieved. The new nation was fragile from the start. In 1822, Agustin de Iturbide crowned himself Emperor Augustin I of Mexico. But his empire was short-lived. Within a year, he was deposed, and Mexico was declared a republic. The early decades of independence were marked by instability. The country faced enormous challenges: financial bankruptcy, regional divisions, and the difficulty of forging unity from such diverse peoples and regions. Governments rose and fell in quick succession, often toppled by military coups. Federalists and centralists clashed over the balance of power between states and the national government. In 1824, Mexico adopted its first republican constitution, but stability remained elusive. Out of this turbulence rose one of Mexico's most controversial figures, Antonio López de Santa Anna. Santa Anna was a general, politician, and opportunist who would dominate Mexican politics for decades. He served as president of Mexico 11 times, switching between liberal and conservative positions as it suited him. Under his rule, Mexico faced foreign invasions and disastrous territorial losses. In 1836, the northern province of Texas, then sparsely settled by Anglo-American immigrants, declared independence. The conflict culminated in battles like the Alamo and San Jacinto, and Texas seceded, later joining the United States. The greater disaster came a decade later. In 1846, war broke out with the United States. American troops invaded Mexico, advancing all the way to Mexico City. In 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico was forced to cede nearly half its territory, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The loss was a national trauma, remembered as La Perdida, the Great Loss. Despite military defeats, Mexico's 19th century was also a period of ideological struggle and reform. In the 1850s, liberal leaders sought to modernize the nation and weaken the grip of the church and military. Under the leadership of Benito Juárez, a Zapotec lawyer from Oaxaca, the reform laws abolished special privileges for clergy and soldiers, established civil marriage, and secularized education. These reforms provoked fierce resistance from conservatives, sparking the War of the Reform, 1858 to 1861, a brutal civil conflict that left the country divided and weakened. Taking advantage of Mexico's instability and debt, France, under Napoleon III, invaded in 1862. Mexican forces won a symbolic victory at the Battle of Puebla on May 5th, a triumph still celebrated as Cinco de Mayo. But French troops soon captured Mexico City and installed an Austrian Archduke, Maximilian of Habsburg, as Emperor of Mexico in 1864. Maximilian sought to rule as a benevolent monarch, introducing reforms and attempting to win popular support. Yet he relied on French troops and alienated conservatives by upholding some liberal policies. The empire never gained legitimacy. By 1867, French forces withdrew under U.S. pressure, and Republican forces under Juárez regained control. Maximilian was captured and executed on June 19, 1867, a dramatic end that marked the triumph of Mexican republicanism. Juarez emerged as a symbol of Mexican resilience. As the first indigenous president of Mexico, he embodied the possibility of a new national identity. His government worked to rebuild the war-torn nation, promote education, and strengthen the republic. Yet even under Juarez, stability was fragile. Regional revolts, economic struggles, and lingering divisions plagued Mexico. After he died in 1872, leadership passed to Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, but his government quickly fell. Out of the chaos emerged a general who would dominate the next era, Porfirio Diaz, a mestizo from Oaxaca who had risen to fame fighting against French intervention. In 1876, Diaz seized power, ushering in the period known as the Porfiriato. His rule would last for more than 3 decades, transforming Mexico's economy and society, but at a steep cost. For now, as the 19th century closed, Mexico was a republic scarred by wars, invasions, and upheavals. It had lost half its territory, fought off a foreign emperor, and struggled to define its identity. Yet through it all, the nation endured, preparing for the next great transformation, the revolution of the 20th century. In 1876, a new figure seized control of Mexico, one who would dominate its political life for more than 3 decades. His name was Porfirio Diaz, a mestizo general from Oaxaca. Rising from humble beginnings, Diaz had made his reputation as a military hero resisting French occupation during the 1860s. When he took power, few could have imagined how profoundly his long presidency, known as the Porfiriato, would transform the nation and how bitterly it would end. Diaz ruled Mexico under the motto, Orden y Progreso, order and progress. To many, he delivered both. After decades of political instability, civil wars, and foreign invasions, Diaz provided something rare: stability. He maintained a firm grip on power, re-elected repeatedly through manipulated elections, coercion, and at times, open force. Yet under this authoritarian rule, Mexico underwent rapid modernization. Diaz courted foreign investment, particularly from the United States and Europe. Railways spread across the country from less than 700 kilometers of track in 1876 to over 20,000 kilometers by 1910. Telegraph lines connected cities and towns. Mining, especially of silver, copper, and oil, expanded dramatically. Vast tracts of land were opened to commercial agriculture, producing exports like henequen, sugar, and coffee. Mexico City, the capital, was reshaped into a modern metropolis with grand boulevards, electric streetlights, and European-style architecture. To visiting foreigners, Mexico under Diaz seemed a country finally catching up with the industrialized world. But progress came at a terrible cost. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a narrow elite of landowners, industrialists, and foreign investors, while the majority of Mexicans saw little benefit. Under Diaz land reforms, communal village lands, held by indigenous communities for centuries, were privatized and sold. By 1910, millions of rural peasants had been stripped of their land, forced to work as laborers on haciendas or plantations. Debt peonage, a system binding workers to employers through perpetual debt, became widespread. Indigenous communities, already marginalized, suffered particularly. They not only lost land, but also faced forced labor and military campaigns when they resisted. The Yaqui people of Sonora, for example, were deported in the thousands to work on plantations in distant Yucatan. Industrial workers fared little better. Conditions in factories and mines were harsh, hours were long, and wages were meager. Strikes were met with brutal repression. The regime's commitment to order meant that dissent was not tolerated. Opposition newspapers were censored, political rivals were exiled, and uprisings were crushed by force. Diaz maintained power through a system of clientelism known as the pan o palo, the carrot or the stick. Supporters were rewarded with patronage and wealth, while opponents faced imprisonment or death. By the early 20th century, cracks began to appear in Diaz's regime. Despite modernization, poverty and inequality deepened. The rural poor, urban workers, and dispossessed indigenous peoples grew restless. Intellectuals and journalists began criticizing the dictatorship. A new generation of reformers inspired by liberal ideals and democratic principles called for change. In 1908, Diaz made a fateful mistake. In an interview with an American journalist, James Creelman, he declared that Mexico was ready for democracy and that he would not seek re-election in 1910. His words sparked hope and political mobilization. Among those inspired was a wealthy landowner from Coahuila named Francisco I. Madero. Educated in Europe and the United States, Madero believed in democracy, suffrage, and political reform. He ran for president in 1910 on an anti-re-election platform. But Diaz, unwilling to relinquish power, rigged the election, imprisoned Madero, and declared himself the winner once again. The fraud of 1910 was the spark that lit the Mexican Revolution. Madero escaped prison and fled to the United States, from where he issued the Plan of San Luis Potosí, calling for Mexicans to rise in arms on November 20th, 1910. Across the country, uprisings erupted. In the north, a charismatic bandit turned revolutionary named Pancho Villa raised an army of cowboys and peasants. In the south, the peasant leader Emiliano Zapata emerged, rallying indigenous villagers under the slogan Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. By 1911, Diaz's regime was collapsing under the weight of rebellion. He resigned and went into exile in France, where he would die in 1915. For many Mexicans, it seemed a new era had dawned. Madero became president in 1911, but governing proved far harder than opposing Diaz. His commitment to democracy and moderation frustrated radicals who wanted sweeping land reform and social change. Zapata, disillusioned, broke with Madero and issued the Plan of Ayala, demanding immediate redistribution of land to peasants. Meanwhile, conservatives, landowners, and military officers resented Madero's reforms and saw him as weak. In February 1913, a coup known as the Decena Tragica, the 10 Tragic Days, unfolded in Mexico City. With the support of the U.S. ambassador, General Victoriano Huerta betrayed Madero, arrested him, and had him executed. Huerta declared himself president, but his regime was widely despised. The overthrow of Madero reignited the revolution. Different factions, each with its own leaders and visions, took up arms. Venustiano Carranza, a landowner and political leader, led the Constitutionalist Army, seeking to restore constitutional order. Pancho Villa, in the north, commanded the Division of the North, a cavalry force that won spectacular victories. Emiliano Zapata, in the south, continued to fight for agrarian reform. Álvaro Obregón, a brilliant general, emerged as one of Carranza's key allies. The revolution became a multi-sided civil war with shifting alliances, battles, and betrayals. Cities changed hands, economies collapsed, and ordinary people bore the brunt of the violence. By 1914, Huerta's regime crumbled under military defeats and U.S. hostility. He resigned and fled, but his departure did not bring peace. Instead, revolutionary leaders turned on each other. Carranza sought to establish himself as head of state, while Villa and Zapata resisted. The civil war that followed devastated Mexico. Villa's forces at first triumphed, but Obregón, commanding Carranza's armies, proved the more skilled strategist. In battles such as Celaya, 1915, he crushed Villa's cavalry with modern tactics and machine guns. Zapata's forces, meanwhile, remained confined to southern strongholds. In 1917, Carranza convened a constitutional congress in Querétaro. The resulting Mexican Constitution of 1917 was one of the most progressive of its time. It established an 8-hour workday, the right to strike, restrictions on foreign ownership of land, and, most importantly, provisions for land reform. It also declared the separation of church and state, extending the anti-clerical legacy of the 19th century reform laws. Yet Carranza himself had little intention of fully implementing these radical provisions. Zapata and Villa continued their resistance, and violence persisted. In 1919, Emiliano Zapata was assassinated in an ambush, a betrayal that turned him into a martyr for agrarian reform. In 1920, Carranza himself was overthrown and killed by rebels led by Obregón. Pancho Villa, after years of guerrilla fighting, retired but was assassinated in 1923. The revolution consumed nearly a decade of bloodshed, leaving an estimated 1 million dead, roughly a tenth of Mexico's population. By 1920, Álvaro Obregón emerged as the new leader of Mexico. A pragmatic general, he recognized that the revolution's ideals of land reform, workers' rights, and social justice could not be ignored. His presidency marked the beginning of a new political order, one that would eventually consolidate under the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, which would dominate Mexican politics for most of the 20th century. The Mexican Revolution had shaken the foundations of society. It had toppled the old Porfirian regime, broken the power of the haciendas, and written a radical new constitution. It had produced iconic figures Zapata, Villa, and Madero, who remained symbols of struggle and justice long after their deaths. Yet it also left scars, villages destroyed, lives shattered, and a legacy of violence and authoritarianism that would shape Mexico's future. When the dust of the revolution finally began to settle in 1920, Mexico was a nation broken but not destroyed. A decade of civil war had left as many as 1 in 10 Mexicans dead and millions displaced. Entire villages lay in ruins, railways and fields stood abandoned, and trust in the government had been shattered. Yet, from this devastation arose a question: how could a fractured country, bled by revolution, be remade into a functioning nation? The man who seized power in 1920 was Álvaro Obregón, a general who had risen through the ranks of the revolutionary armies. Unlike the idealists who had come before him, Obregón was a pragmatist. He understood that the revolution had unleashed forces that could not be ignored: peasants demanding land, workers demanding rights, and intellectuals demanding reform. To secure legitimacy, Obregón presented himself not as a dictator, but as the custodian of the revolution's promises. He oversaw modest land reforms, redistributing hacienda lands to peasants in some regions, though far less than Zapata had envisioned. He also courted organized labor, working with unions like the Confederation Regional Obra Mexicana, CROM, to bring workers under the wing of the state. But Obregón's most lasting contribution was in culture and education. He appointed José Vasconcelos as Minister of Education, who launched sweeping literacy campaigns and promoted the idea of a cosmic race, the blending of indigenous, European, and African heritages into a new Mexican identity. Across the capital, walls were painted with revolutionary murals by artists like Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, whose work celebrated workers, peasants, and indigenous traditions. For the first time, the Mexican state sought to bind its people together not just with laws, but with symbols, culture, and education. Yet Obregón was no idealist. He eliminated rivals ruthlessly, including the assassination of his former ally Pancho Villa in 1923. In 1924, he stepped down, but his influence lingered. Obregón's successor, Plutarco Elias Calles, took a harder line. Known as the Jefe Maximo, Supreme Chief, Calles began building a political machine to prevent future instability. He recognized that endless cycles of caudillo generals seizing power would only perpetuate chaos. His solution was to institutionalize the revolution itself. In 1929, he created the Partido Nacional Revolucionario, PNR, the National Revolutionary Party. This was not a party in the Western democratic sense, but rather a political umbrella under which different factions of the revolution could be accommodated, negotiated, and controlled. Over time, the PNR evolved into the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which would dominate Mexico for most of the 20th century. Calles also confronted the Catholic Church, sparking the violent Cristero War, 1926 to 1929. When the government enforced anti-clerical laws from the Constitution of 1917, restricting the church's power, Catholic peasants in western Mexico revolted. The rebellion claimed tens of thousands of lives before peace was brokered, but it left deep scars in Mexican society. By the early 1930s, Calles controlled politics from behind the scenes, appointing presidents and dictating policy. But this would change with the arrival of one of Mexico's most transformative leaders. In 1934, a young governor from Michoacán, Lázaro Cárdenas, assumed the presidency. Many believed he would be another puppet of Calles. Instead, Cárdenas sidelined his mentor and embarked on one of the most ambitious reform programs in Mexican history. Cárdenas redistributed more land than all his predecessors combined, nearly 45 million acres, much of it organized into ejidos, communal farms worked collectively by peasants. He strengthened unions and encouraged workers to organize, tying them to the state through corporatist structures. His boldest act came in 1938, when he nationalized Mexico's oil industry, expropriating it from foreign companies and creating Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex. This made Cárdenas a national hero. To many Mexicans, the oil expropriation symbolized independence, dignity, and the fulfillment of revolutionary ideals. Cárdenas also welcomed exiles from abroad, most notably Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, who took refuge in Mexico City until his assassination in 1940. By the end of his presidency, Cárdenas had reshaped the revolution into a stable political order, one in which land, labor, and capital were all tied to the state through the PRI. After Cárdenas, Mexico entered a period of stability and economic growth. The PRI perfected its model of governance. Elections were held, but always controlled. Opposition parties existed, but never won. Presidents served one 6-year term, the sexenio, and then stepped aside for the next. From the 1940s to the 1970s, Mexico experienced what became known as the Mexican miracle. Industrialization surged under policies of import substitution, in which domestic industries were protected from foreign competition. Urbanization accelerated, and millions migrated to cities. Mexico City grew into one of the largest metropolises in the world, with highways, universities, and cultural institutions expanding rapidly. The economy grew at an average of 6% per year for decades. A rising middle class emerged, and for many Mexicans, standards of living improved. Cultural pride flourished, with Mexican cinema, music, and art gaining international recognition. But beneath the surface, problems persisted. The PRI's control of politics remained authoritarian. Dissent was managed through co-optation, corruption, or outright repression. Wealth was unevenly distributed, and the benefits of the miracle were concentrated in cities, leaving rural areas impoverished. The dark side of the PRI's rule was revealed in 1968, when Mexico prepared to host the Olympic Games. Student protests erupted in Mexico City, inspired by global movements demanding democracy, social justice, and an end to authoritarianism. On October 2, 1968, just days before the Olympics, government forces opened fire on demonstrators gathered at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco. Hundreds were killed in what became known as the Tlatelolco Massacre. The government suppressed the truth, but the memory of the massacre haunted Mexican society, revealing that beneath the veneer of modernity, repression remained. The 1970s brought new challenges. Rising oil prices initially enriched Mexico as Pemex revenues soared. But by the early 1980s, falling prices and mounting foreign debt plunged the country into crisis. In 1982, Mexico defaulted on its loans, triggering a debt crisis across Latin America. Inflation, unemployment, and poverty spread. To stabilize the economy, Mexico turned to neoliberal reforms. State-owned enterprises were privatized, trade barriers dismantled, and the country opened to foreign markets. These policies culminated in the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994 with the United States and Canada. While NAFTA boosted exports and attracted investment, it also devastated small farmers who could not compete with subsidized American agriculture. On the day NAFTA took effect, January 1st, 1994, an armed indigenous uprising erupted in Chiapas. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZLN, led by the masked figure Subcommandant Marcos, declared war on the Mexican state, demanding indigenous rights, land, and justice. The rebellion, though limited militarily, symbolized the deep discontent hidden beneath Mexico's neoliberal facade. The 1990s also brought political change. The PRI faced growing opposition from rival parties like the Partido Acción Nacional, PAN, and the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, PRD. Electoral fraud, once routine, now provoked outrage. Assassinations of political figures, such as PRI presidential candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio in 1994, revealed the depth of corruption and violence entwined with the system. By the end of the 20th century, the PRI's legitimacy was crumbling. After 70 years in power, the party faced its greatest challenge, democracy. At the turn of the new millennium, Mexico stood at a crossroads. For 71 years, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, had ruled almost unbroken, shaping the nation's politics with a mix of corporatism, patronage, and authoritarian control. But in 2000, that long dominance finally ended. For the first time since the revolution, Mexican voters chose a president from an opposition party. It was a moment that symbolized the arrival of democracy and with it, the hope of renewal. In the elections of July 2000, Vicente Fox, a tall, charismatic former Coca-Cola executive representing the Partido Acción Nacional, PAN, won the presidency. His victory was not just personal, it represented a seismic shift in Mexican politics. For decades, many had doubted that the PRI could ever be unseated through the ballot box, but Fox's win demonstrated the power of the popular vote. Fox's presidency brought optimism. He promised transparency, an end to corruption, closer relations with the United States, and a renewed push for economic growth. Yet, governing proved far harder than campaigning. The PRI still controlled much of Congress and local politics, making reform difficult. Although Fox introduced measures to increase government accountability, his term was marked by legislative gridlock and unmet promises. Still, his election was a watershed. Mexico was no longer a one-party state. Democracy, fragile and contested, had taken root. If Fox's presidency was about transition, his PAN successor, Felipe Calderón, would be defined by war. Taking office in 2006 after a fiercely contested election, Calderón inherited a growing crisis, the rising power of drug cartels. For decades, cartels had smuggled cocaine, marijuana, and heroin through Mexico into the United States, often with tacit tolerance from corrupt officials. But by the early 2000s, these groups had grown into powerful, violent organizations controlling vast territories. Calderón declared war. He deployed tens of thousands of soldiers to fight cartels in states like Michoacán, Tamaulipas, and Chihuahua. The The conflict escalated quickly. Cartels responded with unprecedented brutality. Mass killings, public displays of violence, and assassinations of police, journalists, and officials. The drug war, as it came to be known, reshaped Mexican society. Cities like Ciudad Juarez became synonymous with violence. From 2006 to 2012, more than 60,000 people were killed in drug-related violence, and thousands more disappeared. Critics argued that militarizing the fight only fragmented the cartels, creating smaller but more violent groups. For many Mexicans, daily life was overshadowed by fear. In 2012, the PRI returned to power under Enrique Peña Nieto, a polished politician who promised reform and modernization. For a time, Peña Nieto's government projected a new image abroad: Mexico as a rising economy, integrated with global markets and ready to move beyond its violent image. Peña Nieto introduced sweeping reforms in education, telecommunications, and most controversially, the energy sector. For decades, Mexico's oil industry had been controlled by Pemex, a legacy of Cardenas's 1938 nationalization. Peña Nieto's reforms opened it to private and foreign investment, sparking heated debate about sovereignty and economic justice. But his presidency soon became mired in scandal. Corruption cases multiplied, from the Casa Blanca affair, a luxurious mansion tied to government contracts, to revelations of billions siphoned off by politicians. Most damaging was the Ayotzinapa case in 2014, when 43 students from a rural teachers' college disappeared in Guerrero, allegedly abducted by local police working with criminal groups. The government's handling of the case, marked by cover-ups and contradictions, provoked outrage across the nation. For many Mexicans, it confirmed that corruption and impunity reached the highest levels of power. By the end of Peña Nieto's term, the PRI's image lay in ruins, its old reputation for corruption and authoritarianism reaffirmed in the eyes of a new generation. In 2018, Mexico turned decisively against the old order. Voters elected Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, leader of the left-wing Movimiento Regeneración Nacional, Morena. For decades, AMLO had positioned himself as a populist outsider, a champion of the poor, and a critic of corruption. His landslide victory represented a profound rejection of the political establishment. AMLO promised a fourth transformation of Mexico, placing himself in a line of historic changes: independence, the reform, the revolution, and now his presidency. His government expanded social welfare programs, increased pensions for the elderly, and launched scholarships for students. He sought to reduce inequality, tackle corruption, and give more voice to Mexico's marginalized communities. But his presidency has been controversial. Supporters praise his focus on social programs and his symbolic austerity, such as selling the presidential jet and cutting his own salary. Critics argue he has undermined institutions, centralized power, and weakened checks on the presidency. His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic drew both support and criticism, with debates over public health measures and economic fallout. Violence remains Mexico's greatest challenge. Despite campaign promises, homicide rates have remained high, and the cartels, now fragmented into competing organizations like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, continue to wield immense power. In the 21st century, Mexico has become both a regional power and a nation defined by contradictions. It is the world's 15th largest economy, a member of the G20, and deeply integrated into North America through trade agreements like NAFTA, replaced in 2020 by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Mexican culture, its cinema, literature, music, and cuisine have achieved global recognition. Directors like Guillermo del Toro, Alfonso Cuarón, and Alejandro González Iñárritu have won international acclaim, while Mexican artists and musicians continue to shape cultural currents worldwide. Yet inequality, corruption, and violence continue to define much of daily life. Millions of Mexicans have migrated to the United States in search of opportunity, creating one of the largest diasporas in the world. Remittances sent back home now constitute a vital part of the Mexican economy. As of the early 2020s, Mexico stands at a crossroads much like it did a century ago. The legacy of the revolution's promises of land, justice, and equality remains unfulfilled. The state struggles to maintain control in regions dominated by cartels. The political system, though democratic in form, still faces deep challenges of corruption and mistrust. And yet, Mexico endures. The same resilience that carried it through conquest, colonization, revolution, and authoritarianism continues. Its people are diverse, creative, and defiant, continuing to build a nation that is both ancient and modern, wounded yet unbroken. If we step back and look across the centuries, the story of Mexico stretches like a vast tapestry woven from threads of triumph and tragedy, conquest and resistance, memory and forgetting. From the great city-states of the classic era in 300 CE, through the rise of Teotihuacan, the brilliance of the Maya, the empire of the Mexica, the shattering violence of conquest, the endurance of colonial rule, the fire of revolution, and the struggles of the modern republic, Mexico's history has always been one of transformation. It is a history carved into stone pyramids and written in codices, but also whispered in oral traditions and carried in the lives of millions. A history not linear, but cyclical, where themes of resilience, inequality, and renewal return again and again, each time in new forms. When we trace the arc of power in Mexico, we see an unbroken rhythm of rise and fall. The mighty city of Teotihuacan, which rose from the Valley of Mexico to dominate Mesoamerica by 450 CE, collapsed in flames by 550 CE. The great Maya cities flourished, then fell into silence. The Mexica, arriving as migrants into the valley, built an empire from swampland, only to see it destroyed by European steel and disease. Even under the weight of Spanish colonization, Mexican society did not vanish. It adapted, transformed, and resisted. Indigenous peoples survived in language, ritual, and community, even as their world was reshaped by Catholicism, forced labor, and the global economy of silver. The 19th century repeated the pattern of independence from Spain in 1821, only to descend into decades of instability, foreign invasions, and civil wars. Then, dictatorship under Porfirio Diaz brought modernization but deepened inequality, sparking the flames of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. That struggle, too, brought hope and betrayal, victories and failures, yet laid the foundations of the modern Mexican state. The cycle continues into the present. Democracy achieved in 2000, followed by the rise of new crises in violence, corruption, and inequality. And yet, if there is a single thread running through this history, it is survival. For more than 1,700 years, the people of this land have endured wave after wave of upheaval. They have seen empires rise and crumble, foreign armies march across their soil, and governments fall into corruption and decay. But the people of Mexico endure. They carried with them the corn of their ancestors, the ancient traditions of maize cultivation that remain the heart of their cuisine and culture. They carried their languages, Nahuatl, Maya, Mixtec, Zapotec, Otomi, and countless others, surviving alongside Spanish. They carried their music, their celebrations, their dances, their syncretic blending of Catholic saints with indigenous deities, creating a culture both unique and universal. Every attempt to erase them, whether by colonial rulers, by authoritarian regimes, or by the violence of cartels, has failed. Instead, Mexico remains a land of creativity, resilience, and defiance. Today, Mexico stands as one of the great nations of the world, Its diaspora stretches across the Americas and beyond. Its culture celebrated globally in literature, in cinema, in art, in cuisine. Mexican muralists like Diego Rivera, writers like Octavio Paz, filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro and Alfonso Cuarón continue the tradition of using art to reflect the struggle, the hope, and the contradictions of their homeland. And yet, the challenges remain profound. Violence from organized crime continues to scar the country, corruption corrodes its institutions, and millions live in poverty. The dream of the revolution of land and liberty remains only partly fulfilled. Still, Mexico is not defined solely by its wounds. It is defined by its capacity to heal, to reinvent itself, to rise from ashes again and again. When we walk through Mexico today, we walk across layers of history. Beneath the streets of Mexico City lie the ruins of Tenochtitlan, its great pyramids and temples buried under the stones of colonial cathedrals. Beneath those, still older traces of Teotihuacan, and beneath that, the earth shaped by even earlier civilizations whose names we may never know. Each layer speaks not only of what was lost, but also of what endures. The people of Mexico have carried their past into their present. Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, is not just a festival. It is a dialogue between worlds, a recognition that the ancestors are never fully gone. In that ritual lies the essence of Mexican history itself, the coexistence of loss and endurance, tragedy and renewal. As we close this long journey through Mexico's past, it is worth remembering that history here has never been static. Mexico's story is not finished. From the struggles of the 21st century will emerge new movements, new leaders, and new transformations. Perhaps one day the fourth transformation envisioned by López Obrador will be remembered alongside independence, the reform, and the revolution. Or perhaps the future will bring its own unexpected turn. What is certain is that Mexico's history is a mirror of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience, for destruction and creation. It is a history that warns of the dangers of power, yet also offers inspiration in the endurance of its people. From the pyramids of Teotihuacan to the plazas of modern Mexico City, from the villages of Chiapas to the borderlands of the north, the story of Mexico continues to unfold. It is the story of a nation that has endured conquest, revolution, and globalization, and yet remains rooted in the soil of its ancestors. In that soil, in the cornfields and markets, in the songs and festivals, in the resilience of its people, Mexico reminds us of a truth older than empire, older than the nation-state. That identity is not erased by conquest, that memory outlives power, and that a people, once awakened, can never be silenced. This, then, is the story of Mexico from 300 CE to the present day. A story not of endings, but of continuities. A story still being written, carried in the voices of millions who call this land their home. And as we close, we leave Mexico's history where it has always belonged, not just in the ruins of ancient cities or the archives of scholars, but in the lives of its people who continue to live, to struggle, and to dream.